This video is sponsored by Yoshikawa Paper and Cute Things from Japan. This reshaped my attitude toward paper, and I'm convinced if it isn't the best paper in the last 1500 years, it certainly is the most unusual. Let me show you how I came to that conclusion. This paper that I'm waving around, which is very large for, say, standard size stationery paper, but pretty normal for washi paper, is Wakami's Torinoko Washi Paper. Washi is popping up in a lot of unusual places lately. I've seen some bags made out of it, and this here is kind of a dishcloth where the scrubby side is made out of recycled washi. Having spent a good chunk of my life in Japan, I've always associated washi with shoji screens, the kind of little sliding doors in Japanese homes covered with washi paper. I just moved back to the States and had some stuff in storage delivered, and I had forgotten that I had a screen made out of shortened shoji doors. I had this made in 1990, and it's traveled to 5 different places and been in storage lately for 9 years. It still looks beautiful, and the paper is as strong as ever. The only defect that came about is the wood warped a little bit and pulled away from the inner frame. The paper is just fine. Here's a close-up of the paper. The large fibers are for decorative purposes. Washi has been made in Japan for 1500 years, with the oldest surviving sheet being over 1300 years old. Its earliest uses were for brush writing to copy Buddhist sutras, which in turn morphed into Japanese brush calligraphy. And then it took the notice of artists, everyone from Hokusai for woodblock printing to Rembrandt, Picasso, and Gauguin. Artwork as varied as pencil and watercolor, decoupage, printing in ink, and lithograph can all use washi. It's hard to find an artist who doesn't wax poetic about washi. And washi is widely used for document and paper conservation and restoration. Because of its slow rate of deterioration, its lack of impurities, and its neutral pH, and its ability to be made into very, very thin, transparent, pliable pieces, washi is popular amongst museums as varied as the Smithsonian, the British Museum, and the Washington Library of Congress. The handmade washi paper maker Iwano Ichibe, who is a living national treasure, sends 1 month's work every year to the Louvre for them to use for restoration and conservation work. This paper is so amazing, but what can it not do? Well, fountain pens. When Yoshikawa-san from Yoshikawa Paper and Ayako from Cute Things from Japan asked me to film a video about a paper factory, I was like, sure, that would be really cool. But Yoshikawa-san said, no, I don't want you to just film us making the paper. I want you to see the traditional way and then see how we incorporate that into the way we make our paper. This is Yoshikawa's office. He's a paper distributor and then collaborates to put out finished products. He let us go down to his paper vault where he has all kinds of paper sorted by the type, their name, and their GSM. This is one of Yoshikawa's first forays into actually producing paper, and I'll give you the very interesting reason why in a companion video to this one. This video, which I'll link in the upper right hand corner and in the show notes, is my companion video of all the fun things we did when we went to Echizen. The Echizen area was the first and arguably the most famous area to make washi. It's about an hour or an hour and a half northeast of Kyoto. To learn about the traditional way to make washi, we went to the Iwano Heizaburo paper mill. They have been making paper for over 150 years, with their extended family making paper for over 300. Makiko-san, the lady on the right, is a 4th generation Iwano paper maker. Her great-grandfather started the company. Washi is not made from wood pulp. Wood pulp, typically pine, has a fiber length of about 2 millimeters. Kozo, or paper mulberry, has a fiber length of 7 millimeters. And this is Mitsumata, which has a fiber length of about 5 millimeters. And Gampi, which must be gathered wild since it can't be cultivated, has a fiber length of about 3 millimeters. There are many recipes for washi, but they must use one of those kinds of fibers, and then sometimes they add hemp. These longer fiber lengths are characteristic of washi and make it a very strong paper. Here they're soaking these different fibers. After soaking, then they're boiled in these giant tanks. This releases the fibers. But there's still what they call imperfections or impurities in these fibers. These impurities are like little knots in the bark or discolorations, and they must be picked out by hand. It's a process called chiritori, which literally means picking out dust. It's a painstaking process, but high-quality washi requires this. Washi was many times made in the winter because the farmers couldn't grow their crops then, and so they made paper. And so they did this in the winter time, so a lot of people ended up having like blue hands. So many times in this video, I noticed I was filming people's hands, and in the end, you realize it's such an intensive handmade product. After this, the fibers are put into this scary-looking machine that kind of beats it all up. It is also sometimes beaten with like a mallet. And this is how it looks after it comes out of that machine. What you see soaking here is Tororo Aoi, or the roots of the sunset hibiscus. It is considered the heart of washi paper, and what it does is make the water a little bit viscous so that the pulp floats in the water a little bit longer. The Tororo Aoi, water, and pulp are mixed and put into this big basin. The fine bamboo screen and frame called a sugeta is lowered into the water and swished back and forth in that liquid. Pulp fibers slowly settle onto the screen in increasing thickness. So the only ingredients in this washi paper is the pulp, the hibiscus root, and clear, clean, slightly soft river water. The mill is kept at a consistent low light so the ladies can judge how thick the paper is by how light that dark screen starts becoming. After the paper is at its proper thickness, the ladies unfold a cloth over their already formed stack of papers. Then the screen with the pulp fibers attached to it is raised and then lowered down on top of that cloth. For smaller pieces, this is typically done by hand, but the Iwano mill is famous for being able to make very large sheets of washi paper, sometimes taking 6 people to transfer the screen to the stack of paper. After they've made and layered the paper between sheets of cloth, it is left for a day under pressure to squeeze the water out. What amazed me over and over about this process was the quietness and almost solemnness of this whole procedure. There was no TV blaring, no music, there wasn't a lot of idle chit-chat. Here's a clip of the general atmosphere that I just loved. Here's a stack of pressed, partially dried paper. From this pile, these guys peel off a single sheet of cloth with the paper still attached to it and lay it on a drying board. The paper sticks to the board and they peel off the cloth. For the smoothest paper, they use ginkgo. For different kinds of texture, they'll use different kinds of wood. Then they use brushes and smoothing instruments to smooth the paper to make it stick. After they smooth the paper out into the drying board, these boards are stacked into a drying room. And after dried, the paper is peeled off and stacked. This is a stack of finished paper, and notice the raw edges where the fibers kind of stuck to the edge of the screen. Washi paper typically has a very smooth side, the side that dries against the board, and then the top side is a little bit more textured. This is their most famous paper, kumohada, which is cloud skin. Valued by artists all over the world, it is strong, stiff, and slightly transparent. Its secret sauce is the addition of hemp. We'll be leaving the Iwano Heizaburo mill to go to the shrine that is dedicated to the only goddess of paper. This is the Otaki Okamoto Shrine, the only place that enshrines the only deity of paper in Japan, the Wakami Gozen, the goddess of paper. This was a quiet, lovely break between the traditional making of washi to what we're going to next, the factory-produced washi. I'll have more about this shrine in my companion video. We are now at the home and paper mill of Ishikawa-san. Here he is with Ayako and Kei. His family has been making paper since the Edo period. They switched to machine-made paper in 1961. Near his mill and home, he took us to some land that he owns where the local elementary school kids harvest kozo, the paper mulberry bush. The branches can be cut and they return the next year, so it's a yearly harvest. Then these kids from this elementary school make washi paper the traditional way to print their graduation certificates when they graduate from elementary school. I found this to be fascinating, and it shows how invested he is and the rest of the community in washi paper. Unlike handmade washi, they don't make their own pulp. Here he's showing us the sheets of pulp he uses. Here's a close-up of the pulp sheet, and you can see the tiny fibers in it. And here's a pulp sheet for hemp, and you can see that it has long, luxurious fibers, which make the paper very strong, and this pulp sheet is actually very difficult to tear. These pulp sheets are boiled and blended with water in this kind of food processor thing. And like traditional washi, they use filtered river water. Here you can see him adding a pulp sheet to the mix. The river water is important because soft water allows the fibers in the pulp to tangle more easily to make strong paper. And like the traditional washi paper makers, Ishikawa is always hands-on. Here he's checking and showing us the pulp. Ishikawa is explaining to Ayako this base pulp mixture is pumped into these scary-looking tanks underground. On the day the paper is to be made, this base pulp mixture is pumped up from those underground tanks into these giant mixers where they add sheets of different kinds of pulp according to their recipe. This recipe is proprietary, but it does contain the basic washi materials. This recipe is a collaboration between Yoshikawa, who is producing and wants to sell the paper, with Ishikawa, who actually makes the paper at his mill. One of Ishikawa's mill's stated goals is to bring washi paper into the modern age. So Yoshikawa wants to sell a paper that can do woodblock printing, watercolor, lithographs, along with inkjet and laser printing and use with fountain pens. This is probably one of the few times in my life I'd be able to say modern era and fountain pens in the same sentence. At this stage, the Tororo Aoi and the different kinds of color that make different shades of white are added. Then this pulp mixture is piped into the paper making machine. The machine already has water flowing through it, and this mixture is mixed in with that water. The screen that catches the pulp out of the pulpy water is made out of plastic netting. The water is sprayed on the plastic netting and then pulled out along these giant rollers to squeeze some of the water out. The dryer is a separate machine. Here the paper is separated from the plastic screen and just kind of bundling up there. What he's doing, he's waiting for the paper to become the proper thickness so then he can peel it off of that machine and put it onto the dryer. He's tearing it to gauge the proper thickness. If you think this is wasted paper, this paper comes into play later. Here at the right thickness, he's peeled it off and put it up on the upper machine, which is the dryer. A little bit got snagged up, so Ishikawa just tore it until the whole sheet was able to go up into the dryer. Much like traditional washi, the side of the paper that's on the dryer roll is smooth and the other side of the paper is textured. The paper has to go on a second dryer machine, and that too has to be manually done. And then after going through the second dryer, we're finally ready to roll the paper up. Then these large rollers are cut up on this special old-fashioned cutting machine. You need to check it out. This really cracks me up because this is like a factory-made paper, but some of the machines are like antiques. And then he cuts it with, I kid you not, like a sickle kind of thing. And I find this so very satisfying. And then the paper is checked sheet by sheet for imperfections or any problems. And this is my favorite scene of the whole trip. A lady sitting seiza on a zabuton with a little thermos next to her, carefully and quietly checking the paper. Yoshikawa's family paper business was started in 1909, and he's the fourth generation. He comes to Echizen for every run of his washi paper that's about once a month, and here he's checking the last run so he can compare it to this one. What we saw was just a small batch, and he's looking at it for color and quality. He always wears black so there's no reflection off of his clothes onto the paper. There's some sort of tradition that washi paper should be checked in the first light of the morning. He's saying here that it looks a little red, and explained that red is the most vivid color to show up in white. Quay and Ayako-san say that their untrained eyes cannot see the red. Ishikawa, Sato, and Yoshikawa are discussing whether or not this paper has passed the test, and they decided it didn't. So they'll do another run and adjust the colors. Again, if you think this is a waste of paper, I'll explain it later. And Yoshikawa wants to remind you, after all the quality checks have been passed, on the very upper floor attic area of the mill is where they season their paper. It's a strange kind of room where you're walking over stacks of paper. Of course, we're not wearing shoes, but it's still kind of strange. Here, Ishikawa-san is hanging the paper. Seasoning is basically getting the paper to adjust to a proper humidity level. Sometimes the paper loses too much moisture in the drying phase, and this rectifies that. Here is what it looks like when the whole order is hung out to dry. Remember that too thin rolled up washi going to the dryer, and also the washi paper that did not pass the color test? Well, we have an answer for that. The answer is that Yoshikawa collects trash. He takes that washi paper that didn't go to the dryer, the washi paper that didn't pass the color test, and the trash, and turns it into Wakami Sutenai. Sutenai means don't throw away, and it is recycled paper made of washi and trash, and it's 100% recycled paper. There's no new pulp in there. The notebook is stitched in the middle so that you can take the end, cut it, and pull out the thread in order to recycle the paper again. Yoshikawa collects paper at his office and also uses a company that collects suitable trash from offices. Then they're all delivered down to Ishikawa's mill. It takes about a day to sort through all the trash to eliminate things that are not suitable. For instance, these aren't suitable because they either have tape on them or a plastic coating or something that makes it that they can't use it. And just like pulp, they soak the paper. I think that's pretty cool. And then they make the base pulp, which is the stuff that's left over from the dryer and also the washi that didn't pass the color test. Yoshikawa is particularly concerned about all the cardboard boxes we use for online shopping, so he really tries to use as much cardboard as he can. It too is soaked, and he's got it up to about 20% of the material is cardboard. This recipe is also proprietary, but you really need the washi to keep that recycled material strong and pliable. And just like his Torinoko Washi paper, the paper has to pass Yoshikawa's quality test. Okay, so how does the paper perform? They tested it on both an inkjet printer and a laser printer. The photographs were crisp and clear with great color reproduction, and all kinds of printing was clean without any kind of bleed through. And at the factory, Quay was our artist who tested the paper hot off the press. She brought all kinds of stationery supplies to include watercolors and fountain pens. It was pretty wild watching her test all these different watercolors there in a little corner of the noisy factory. And at first glance, it seemed like the strength of the paper is that it could hold up and not bleed through the backside. And chromo shading inks held up fine, but didn't really show their chromo shading till you added water. On closer inspection at home, I just can't believe how beautiful the watercolors came out. And normal fountain pen usage looked pretty good. And where it really did shine was when you added water to anything. Though they didn't bleed, highly sheening inks didn't sheen much. With the way watercolor reacted, you can really tell that washi was originally made for brush lettering. It's fine to use with a Sharpie, it's clear and it does not bleed through. But if you do weird stuff like this, like I do, that's not going to work out too well. Though this didn't bleed through, it didn't have very crisp edges. But this nuttiness is outside the parameters of most fountain pen users. These notebooks are basically pieces of paper laid out with stitching in the middle to make the notebook. Now remember, there's a textured side and a smooth side on washi paper. So in the front half of the notebook, the back side is textured. And the opposite is true with the back half of the notebook. Chokuro on a 2.4 nib is nice, clean, and crisp on the front side, and the same is true on the back side. The interesting thing about shimmering ink is the glitter kind of got embedded into the fibers. It made the shimmer a bit harder to see, but it also didn't rub off on you as easily. I didn't spell it correctly, but Hotarubi in a 4.5 did really well. And just normal writing with a fountain pen was awesome, and the ink seemed to dry a little bit faster than normal. And so did straight up flex writing. I found that it handled dry inks a lot better than normal paper. And hand oils didn't seem to be a problem as much as on some papers. Ballpoint was fine, and I absolutely loved writing with pencil in it. On the recycled paper, Chokuro was crisp. Sailor ink in a medium nib was fine. A medium to wet ink was great. And shimmering ink will be more subtle. But if you want to try something like this, don't. Especially if you have arachnophobia. That stuff looked like cobwebs. But it didn't bleed through to the other side. And it also handled water really well, and it looked especially good when you used it on chromo shading inks. Yoshikawa-san brought some large sheets of Torinoko Washi to our pen club so we could have a variety of people trying out the paper. Little Lou, a popular graphic designer here in Japan, drew my face in fountain pen. She's incredibly popular for her cool drawings and traveler's notebooks. I'll leave her details in the show notes, and if you go to the San Francisco Pen Show, make sure you look for her there at Pinky Elephant Crafts table. Dana, our resident artist, did some watercoloring and some pencil sketching. Her beautiful watercolor held up well, and her sketch did too, but she had some good feedback for artists. When she does her pencil sketches, she does a lot of smudging and erasing. Here she used a fountain pen on the straight up paper. But after she erased, it ended up kind of making the paper rougher, and then when she used the fountain pen over the top of that, the ink ended up bleeding. So don't use a fountain pen after roughing up the paper with an eraser. A lot of people don't realize CY from Tokyo Station Pens has really beautiful script, and that did not bleed through. And Esther from Wanderlust by TSL did a beautiful pen and ink drawing of a wolf. Jamie made sure stamps worked, and people tested out different pens and markers. I didn't realize we had so many artists in our group. And Quay's children made sure that crayon worked very well on this paper. And then someone drew this giant picture of Mount Fuji, and then everybody kind of drew little animals and stuff on it. So, this Wakami Torinoko Washi paper can do everything that washi paper is famous for. Watercolor, pencil drawings, lithographs, woodblock prints, and anything to do with pretty much, well, the art world. Then it can do modern inkjet and laser printing, and it handles most fountain pen applications, though it's a little weak on chroma shading, sheening, and heavy applications of ink. It has a traditional smooth and textured sides, and most importantly, it's put me firmly into the paper culture. I feel like it connects me in a long, thin, tenuous line to a farmer a long time ago, like washing fiber in the river to make paper. True paper aficionados are really going to want to check this out. I am completely besotted with this paper. When I use this paper, I pay attention. Both Ayako from Cute Things from Japan and Yoshikawa from Yoshikawa Paper will be at the Yoseka Stationery Fair this year. They'll be sharing a table and bring both the Wakami Torinoko Washi Paper notebooks and also the recycled one, Sutenai. Yoshikawa will also bring traditional washi paper so you can compare it to these washi papers. We hope to see you there.